Sitting in the late afternoon of June 6, 1889, flames erupted from the cellar of a carpentry workshop at the intersection of Front and Madison Streets in Seattle, Washington. A container of hot adhesive tipped over onto a heap of wood shavings. In mere minutes, the floor was ablaze. Within hours, 24 city blocks were lost. 64 acres of the city's core had been transformed into ash, warped metal, and steaming rubble. The commonly told account calls this a tragic mishap. A careless young worker, a gust of summer air, parched timber, poor fortune. Yet, when officials picked through the wreckage in the following days, they observed something odd. Something the formal reports tucked away in the back of the file. The blaze had been discriminating. It devoured the timber structures, the newly erected buildings, the storefronts hastily assembled by opportunists during the 1880s gold rush. Scattered across the devastation, specific structures stood entirely unscathed. Large stone edifices, elaborate brick exteriors, buildings that, according to official documentation, had been erected just a handful of years before the wooden shanties around them. So why did the inferno bypass them? And why, upon reconstruction, did Seattle entomb the original roads under 30 feet of debris, seal the entrances, and abandon what lay below? To grasp what truly unfolded in Seattle, you must first see the city as it appeared the morning of the blaze. The official narrative goes like this. Seattle was a young frontier outpost established in 1851 by the Denny Party, a band of pioneers who journeyed the Oregon Trail and reached Alki Point. By 1889, the city was under 4 decades old. Its population numbered roughly 25,000 people. Its economy relied on lumber, fishing, and the aspiration of becoming the terminus for the Transcontinental Railway. Most structures in the city were made of timber. That much is accurate. Anyone who has examined a picture of frontier-era Seattle can see rows of wooden shopfronts, fake facades, and timber boardwalks. The Pacific Northwest was thick with trees, making lumber affordable. So, when pioneers arrived, they constructed with what they had. Yet here is the part the official story downplays. Interspersed among those timber structures were buildings that seemed out of place. Massive stone and brick edifices with carved moldings, intricate cornerstones, and architectural flourishes, demanding a skill level that, according to historians, did not exist on the West Coast during the 1880s. The Boston Block, the Pioneer Building, the Yesler Building, the Burke Building. These were not log cabins thrown together by settlers. These were European-style commercial palaces, rising 6 and 7 stories, featuring cast iron supports, terracotta cladding, and stonework that would have demanded years of labor. Yet records claim they were all constructed within a few years of one another by a populace that only a decade earlier had been removing tree stumps with hand tools. The fire ignited just after 2:30 p.m. James McGow, an assistant in the basement shop, upset a glue pot. He attempted to douse it with water, which only caused the burning adhesive to spread across the floor. Within 20 minutes, the structure was completely aflame. Within an hour, the fire had spread to the neighboring timber buildings. The fire department, still a volunteer unit at the time, arrived with horse-pulled equipment and uncovered a problem that would trouble the city for years. The water pressure had vanished. The timber water mains beneath the streets could not deliver enough volume to combat a blaze of this magnitude. The hoses went slack, the flames climbed higher, and by nightfall, the entire commercial heart of Seattle was a blazing inferno visible from 40 miles away. Witnesses claimed to see the glow reflecting off clouds above Tacoma. Boats in Puget Sound observed the city burning from the water. By the time the flames exhausted themselves the next morning, the formal damage report listed 31 city blocks impacted. With the worst destruction covering 25 blocks, the monetary loss was calculated at $20 million in 1889 currency, equivalent to nearly $700 million today. And amid the smoking debris, Something unthinkable was still standing. The Pioneer Building, located at the intersection of First Avenue and James Street, emerged from the fire largely untouched. Photographs taken shortly after the catastrophe show the structure rising from an ocean of wreckage. Its red brick walls blackened but intact, its stone foundations undisturbed. The official explanation claims the Pioneer Building was still being built at the time, and thus mostly vacant, which somehow shielded it. Yet, that same reasoning fails for the other structures that survived. The Korn Building, the New England Hotel, the Schwebacher Building, the Olympic Block. All of these were in use. All were encircled by burning timber structures, and all emerged from the fire with little beyond smoke discoloration. Examining the photographs side by side, the trend is unmistakable. The fire consumed everything erected during the 1880s. It left almost untouched what records claim was built in that same decade, yet appeared significantly older. Now, critics will argue this is simply survivorship bias. I need to pause for a moment, because what I just described represents just one example from a broader pattern. There are 35 documented instances in a compilation I have assembled. Different locations, different eras, different forms of evidence. Every single one follows the same progression. Discovered, recorded, obtained, vanished. I could not include all of it in one video. It is located in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. That the stone structures endured because they were stone. That fire travels through timber and halts at masonry. On the surface, that rationale appears plausible, but it falls apart when you examine the actual physics of the 1889 fire. The heat generated by a fire of this scale was estimated at over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. That is sufficient to liquefy steel, sufficient to disintegrate standard brick, sufficient to reduce limestone to dust. We know this because in other major fires of that period, like the Great Chicago Fire of 1871 or the San Francisco Fire of 1906, brick and stone structures collapsed in large numbers. Those fires consumed everything. Walls fell, mortar failed, stone fractured from thermal shock. Yet in Seattle in 1889, specific buildings stood as if designed to endure a blast furnace. To grasp why this matters, you must understand what Tartarian researchers have been documenting for the past 10 years. Their theory proposes that before the mid-1800s, a worldwide civilization existed that constructed cities of remarkable scale and beauty. This civilization, often called Tartaria, possessed construction methods, materials, and energy systems we no longer fully comprehend. Their buildings featured enormous domes, elaborate facades, detailed stonework, and architectural complexity that mass production cannot replicate at any reasonable cost. Then, somewhere between approximately 1800 and 1900, a series of events wiped this civilization from historical memory. Wars, floods, plagues, and most notably fires. Strange selective fires that raced through major cities across the globe. And when cities were reconstructed, the new buildings were smaller, less ornate, and built with cheaper materials. History books were rewritten to assert that the original buildings had been constructed by settlers who had in truth merely inherited them. Now, I realize what you are thinking. This sounds absurd. Settlers do not inherit buildings. Civilizations do not get erased, and the United States is supposedly too young to have hidden an earlier society. But Tartarian researchers do not ask you to accept their word. They ask you to look at the photographs. There are over 4,000 archived photographs of them, housed at the University of Washington Special Collections, at the Museum of History and Industry, and in private collections digitized over the last 20 years. When you carefully examine these images, the irregularities multiply rapidly. There are buildings in downtown Seattle photographed during the 1870s and 1880s displaying construction methods the city supposedly lacked the ability to produce. The Yesler Mansion, which overlooked the harbor from its hilltop position, featured carved stone details that would have required skilled stonemasons working for years. The Occidental Hotel, supposedly built in 1864, had a cast iron front with ornamental details imported from where exactly? The records do not specify. The Fry Opera House, finished in 1884, had a 5-story ornate facade that, by modern construction estimates, would cost upwards of $50 million to build. And we are expected to believe that a frontier settlement of fewer than 25,000 people with no foundries, no stone masonry shops, and no architectural training programs simply built these structures within a few years using imported materials shipped around Cape Horn. The financial logic does not hold. Shipping records from that era show what arrived in Seattle. Lumber going out, fish going out, coal going out, and coming in were tools, food supplies, and basic manufactured items. There are no records of the massive shipments of carved stone, cast iron pillars, and decorative terracotta required to build the structures visible in the photographs. The materials are simply present in the city without any documented supply chain. The same holds true for the workforce. The 1880 U.S. Census lists Washington Territory's population at roughly 75,000 people. Of those, perhaps 5% were skilled tradespeople, stonemasons, ironworkers, master carpenters. That gives you at most about 4,000 skilled workers distributed across the entire territory. Yet during that same period, Seattle alone produced enough monumental architecture to fill a European capital. Tacoma did the same. Portland did the same. San Francisco, which records claim transformed from a dusty mission outpost in 1846 into a city of grand performance halls and cathedrals by 1870, did the same on an even greater scale. The numbers do not align. The materials do not align. The labor does not align. And then, in 1889, the fire arrived. When Seattle rebuilt following the fire, the City Council enacted a series of regulations that, on the surface, focused on safety and modernization. No more wood construction in the commercial district. All new buildings required brick or stone. The streets had to be elevated to prevent tidal flooding, as the original downtown was built only a few feet above sea level. Sewer lines needed extension, water mains replacement. The work would take years, but concealed within those regulations was a decision never fully explained. The city elected to raise street levels by an average of 12 to 13 feet across most of downtown. They did not tear down the surviving structures. They did not remove the original ground floors. They simply constructed retaining walls around the old streets, filled them with dirt and rubble, and built new sidewalks at the higher level. The original first floors of the surviving buildings became basements. The original walkways became tunnels. The original storefronts were boarded up and abandoned. And for over 50 years, almost no one spoke of what lay below. The Seattle Underground, as it came to be known, was officially closed in 1907 due to concerns about bubonic plague. The entrances were sealed. Newspapers stopped reporting on it. School textbooks stopped referencing it. By the 1930s, most Seattle residents were unaware it even existed. It was not until 1965, when a local businessman named Bill Speidel began leading tourist tours through the underground, that the public rediscovered what had been buried beneath their feet. And what they found was peculiar. The streets down there were wider than the streets above. The buildings had architectural details inconsistent with their supposed construction dates. There were ornate iron lampposts, marble countertops, intricate tile patterns, and ceiling heights, suggesting the original first floors were designed for a level of grandeur no frontier town would have pursued. There were also things with no official explanation. Symbols carved into stones, tunnels heading nowhere, doors bricked shut from the inside, architectural features that, viewed with modern eyes, match nothing we associate with 1880s American construction. Now, here is where the story becomes even stranger. Seattle is not alone in this. Across the United States between roughly 1870 and 1910, dozens of major cities experienced the exact same chain of events. A catastrophic fire, selective destruction that consumed new construction while sparing certain older structures, a massive rebuilding project that in many cases involved raising street levels by 10, 20, or 30 feet. And a public memory that within one generation had entirely forgotten what was buried underneath. Chicago burned in 1871. Boston burned the following year. Spokane burned in 1889, just 3 months after Seattle. Jacksonville burned in 1901. San Francisco burned in 1906. Baltimore burned in 1904. Each of these fires was officially blamed on a different cause. A cow knocking over a lantern, a defective gas pipe, an electrical short, a laboratory mishap. The official causes are always minor, routine, and believable. But the patterns of destruction are always identical. The new buildings perish, the old buildings endure, and during the rebuilding, the original streets are buried. In Chicago, the original water tower, which is the before I continue. That document in the pinned comment. If you have not located it yet, go there immediately, because everything I present in these videos is one fragment of a pattern that only becomes visible when you examine all 35 cases together. The document reveals the full pattern. What I can show you here is the exterior. What lies below is everything underneath it. Pinned comment now, then return. The most famous surviving structure from the 1871 fire remains a tourist attraction today. The official story claims it survived because it was limestone, but dozens of other limestone buildings existed in Chicago in 1871, and nearly all of them collapsed. The water tower is the anomaly that no one can truly explain. Look at photographs of the devastation. The wooden city is gone. The water tower remains. The pattern matches exactly what happened in Seattle 18 years later. In San Francisco, the 1906 earthquake and fire destroyed an estimated 80% of the city. Yet the buildings that survived were almost always the older, more ornate structures from the supposed gold rush period. The Ferry Building, the Old Mint, the Palace Hotel, which technically burned, but whose stone walls remained upright while every wooden structure around it disintegrated. And in San Francisco, just like in Seattle, the rebuilding involved burying or removing original ground levels that did not match the new simplified architectural style preferred by the city council. There is a researcher named Philip Druzinin who spent over a decade documenting these patterns across American and European cities. His conclusion was straightforward. The fires of the late 1800s were not random accidents. They were a coordinated event, a clearing operation, a method to remove evidence of the prior civilization and replace it with a simplified, manageable story. He noted that in nearly every case, the fires occurred just as a major industrial or political shift was underway. Seattle was on the verge of becoming a key railroad hub. Chicago was about to host the world's Columbian Exposition. San Francisco was about to become the gateway to the Pacific. The fires conveniently cleared the old infrastructure at the precise moment when a new economic system required a fresh start. Druzinin's work has been dismissed by mainstream historians, which, depending on your perspective, either disproves his claims or confirms them. But you do not have to rely on a fringe researcher's assertions. You can examine the construction records yourself. The Pioneer Building, which survived the Seattle fire, was officially designed by architect Elmer H. Fisher and completed in 1892, 3 years after the fire. Yet there are photographs of the Pioneer Building, or a structure identical to it in the same location, dated 1887. The same holds true for several other Seattle landmarks. The official completion dates do not align with the photographic evidence. Records show buildings completed after they already appears fully constructed in earlier photographs. The standard historical response is that the photographs are incorrectly labeled, that the dates are approximations, that period cameras were unreliable. But that explanation requires you to believe that dozens of professional photographers working independently all made the identical error regarding the same buildings in the same way. It is simpler to believe that the buildings were already present and that the official completion dates were assigned afterward to fit a more comfortable narrative. The architectural style of the surviving buildings is another piece of the puzzle. Architectural historians have a name for the style of the Pioneer Building, the Burke Building, and the other survivors. They call it Richardsonian Romanesque, named after Henry Hobson Richardson, the Boston architect who popularized the style in the 1870s. The style features massive stone arches, rough-hewn masonry, ornate carved details, and an impression of weight and permanence that makes the buildings appear centuries old. The official story claims this style was a brief American trend that swept through cities between 1875 and 1895. But here is the strange part. The same style appears in cities worldwide that had no connection to Henry Hobson Richardson. You can find Richardsonian Romanesque buildings in Vienna, in St. Petersburg, in Buenos Aires, in Cape Town, in Sydney, all supposedly built within the same narrow time frame, all featuring the same massive stone arches, the same rough-hewn masonry, the same carved details. The mainstream explanation is that the style spread through architectural journals and books. The Tartarian explanation is that the style was not invented in the 1870s. It was inherited. It was the surviving architectural language of a civilization that by the late 1800s was being deliberately erased. There is another detail about the Seattle fire that almost no one discusses. The Seattle Post-Intelligencer, the city's primary newspaper, published a story on June 8, 1889, 2 days after the fire, describing witnesses who saw unusual lights in the sky above the city in the hours before the fire began. The article was buried on page 7, never reprinted, and most modern accounts of the fire do not reference it. But the original microfilm exists. You can read it at the University of Washington Library. Witnesses described a column of bluish-white light, visible for several minutes, that appeared to descend from the clouds above the downtown waterfront. Some witnesses claimed the light was so bright that it cast shadows. Others said it made no sound. One witness, a dock worker named Patrick Connolly, described the light as hovering motionless in the sky for nearly 10 minutes before fading away. The newspaper did not link the lights to the fire. But the timing is difficult to dismiss. The lights appeared in the late morning. The fire began in the early afternoon, and no one in the official investigation ever questioned Patrick Connolly or any of the other witnesses about what they had actually seen. This is where Tartarian researchers diverge. Some believe the late 1800s fires were caused by directed energy weapons, possibly using technology originally belonging to the Tartarian civilization to destroy itself. The bluish-white lights described in the Seattle newspaper and in similar accounts from other fires of that era are presented as evidence of such technology. Again, other researchers believe the explanation is more straightforward. They believe the fires were started conventionally, but that the targeting of specific buildings and the post-fire decisions to bury rather than restore the original streets were the real conspiracy. Either way, the remaining question is the same. Why did specific buildings survive when, by every physical and chemical principle, they should have been destroyed? And why, when the city rebuilt, did they choose to bury the original ground level instead of clearing it away? If you walk through downtown Seattle today, you can still observe the evidence if you know where to direct your attention. Pioneer Square neighborhood, which is the core of the original downtown, contains over 20 buildings that survived the 1889 fire. If you take one of the underground tours, you can walk through the original streets, those buried after the fire. You can see the cast iron storefronts never intended to become basements. You can see the original sidewalk skylights, the purple glass squares set into the modern walkways that once illuminated shops that no longer exist. You can stand in a tunnel that was once a busy street and look up at a ceiling that was once the sky. And if you examine the architectural details on the surviving buildings, you can notice things the tour guides do not mention. Symbols carved into stone keystones, patterns matching symbols found on similar buildings in St. Petersburg and Vienna. Construction techniques, such as specific patterns of stone joinery and ornamental ironwork, that should not exist in a frontier settlement built by gold rush pioneers. The city of Seattle today does not want you to ask these questions. The Pioneer Square Historic District is managed by a preservation board that is very careful about what gets researched, what gets photographed, and what gets published regarding the underground. Several independent researchers over the past 20 years have requested access to the sealed sections of the underground for documentation purposes. Their requests have been denied. The official reason is safety. The unofficial reason, depending on who you ask, is that there are sections of the underground containing architectural features that contradict Seattle's official history, and that the city would prefer those features to remain unphotographed and undiscussed. There are entire blocks of the original downtown never opened to the public. There are tunnels the tour route does not enter. There are doors set into the foundations of buildings, supposedly dating from the 1890s, that lead into spaces not cataloged in any public record. Consider what happened in Spokane, Washington, just 3 months after the Seattle fire. On August 4, 1889, a fire erupted in a boarding house on Railroad Avenue. By the time it ended, 32 city blocks lay destroyed. The official cause was a candle left burning near some curtains. The pattern was identical to Seattle. The wooden buildings vanished. The stone and brick structures, the ornate commercial palaces along Riverside Avenue, emerged nearly untouched. The Review Building, the Crescent Block, and the Auditorium Theater all survived in the heart of the burned area. And just as in Seattle when Spokane rebuilt, the City Council ordered street levels raised by several feet across the downtown core. The original walkways were buried. The original first floors became basements. The new construction was simpler, smaller, and easier to explain. 2 cities, 2 states, 3 months apart, the exact same sequence of events. Then, think about what happened to the Burke Building in Seattle in 1973. The Burke was one of the most magnificent of the survivors, a 6-story Romanesque masterpiece with a cast-iron facade and stonework that even mid-century preservationists called irreplaceable. It had survived the 1889 fire. It had survived the 1949 earthquake. It had survived 90 years of weather, war, and development. And then, in 1973, the federal government demolished it to construct a parking garage for the new federal courthouse. Citizens protested. Architects pleaded for the building to be relocated or preserved. The city council voted to demolish it anyway. When the wrecking crews arrived, they did not simply tear it down. They ground the carved stone facade into gravel and transported it to a private landfill. No museum was permitted to claim the fragments. No university was allowed to study the construction methods. The building was erased, and the only photographs of its interior details that survive are a handful of black and white images in the Seattle Municipal Archives. The pattern, once recognized, never stops repeating. The old buildings are removed one by one, decade by decade, until the only ones left are those tourists pay to see. And even those are described in ways that suppress the questions a curious visitor might raise. What we know for certain is this. On June 6, 1889, a fire started in a basement at Front and Madison. By the time it burned out, 25 city blocks lay destroyed. The buildings that survived shared a common architectural style that statistically and physically should not exist in a frontier settlement of 25,000 people. The rebuilding involved burying the original streets under up to 30 feet of fill. The buried streets contain evidence of a level of urban development inconsistent with the official history, and the same pattern, with minor differences, repeated itself in dozens of major American cities in the decades surrounding the Seattle fire. You can choose to believe this is all coincidence. You can believe the surviving buildings simply happened to be well constructed, that the burials were a sensible response to flooding and disease, and that the photographic irregularities are merely careless record-keeping. Or you can believe that something else occurred in the late 1800s. Something coordinated, something involving the destruction of an older civilization, the rewriting of the historical record, and the burial of evidence that was, literally, too solid to demolish. The truth is that the surviving buildings of Pioneer Square still stand. The Burke Building was demolished in 1973, which was its own controversy. But the Pioneer Building, the Corn Building, the Schwabacher Building, the New England Hotel, and a dozen others are still there. You can walk inside them. You can study their stonework. You can run your hand along the carved keystones and the cast iron columns. You can stand in the basements that were once ground floors and look at walls that survived a fire that, by every reasonable measure, should have destroyed them. And you can ask yourself the question that official histories do not want you to ask. Who truly built these buildings? And what is the city of Seattle so determined to keep buried beneath our feet? Because once you begin looking, you cannot stop. You start noticing the same patterns in every old city you visit. The Grand Beaux-Arts post offices in towns of 2,000 people. The opera houses in mining camps. The cathedrals in places that, according to records, had no construction industry. The municipal buildings with carved stone details that no living craftsman could reproduce at any reasonable cost. The America we are told existed in the 1800s, a country of log cabins, dirt roads, and frontier struggle, does not match the America that photographs and surviving buildings reveal. There is a gap in the record. A gap that someone at some point decided to fill with a comfortable story about pioneers and gold rushes and railroads. The 1889 Seattle fire is not merely a historical curiosity. It is a piece of evidence, a small fragment in a much larger puzzle about who we are, where we originate, and what existed here before us. The fire burned for 2 days. The cover-up has continued for over a century, and the buildings, the silent witnesses to whatever truly happened, are still standing in the heart of downtown Seattle. The fire consumed the new structures. The old structures remained. And someone, somewhere, decided that the truth about why was something the rest of us were better off not knowing.